I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. I'm so glad to see you. You know, we're meeting, Dr. Joan, we're meeting today. It's 3 days since the election. So I feel like this conversation, honestly, it's a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, we're looking ahead. A lot of us are thinking we're going to have difficult conversations. We're going to have challenging ways of moving forward. And hate is probably not the answer. So how do we find a way to move forward? So I feel, as I read your book, I looked at it before, but I went through it carefully prior to this. I thought, well, this is exactly what we need in these times, is to have a way to talk about race and, as you say, and other hard things. We're going to have hard things. So thank you so much for being here. Your work inspires me. I loved your book. You know what I like about your book? I think it's a combination of theoretical and practical. And then you just have courage. You just put it all out there. This is what happened to me. There's no holding back. You're so transparent. I think that must be part of your whole way. I'm going to be who I am, and this is who I am. But I loved the combination of theory and practice. And like I said, it's in some ways, unfortunately, it's a book for the times. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
This is kind of probably sound like I don't even have to ask this question, but in light of the election results, why do we need to learn to talk about race and other hard things? Why do you think that's an important thing for us to do?
There's so many ways to go with that question.
Right.
And, so to go just literally with it, I think part of what has happened over the last probably, 4, 5, 6, 8 years is that we have moved away from our ability to even talk about or acknowledge race, right? And yet it is such a huge part of what is happening in this country now. We are actually divided more, in my opinion, racially than we have been in my 58 years on this planet. Like, I really feel like, but the difference is before we would at least talk about and acknowledge that there was some racial tension and racial divide. And now we won't even acknowledge it's about race. We're saying it's about, pride, or we're saying it's about, who's American. We're saying it's about, don't tread on me and my rights and all this stuff. And yet we're not actually being honest. We're not being honest about the fact that it is based on a racial divide. People are making choices about who they're engaging with based on how they look. And so you don't know anything about my politics. You only know what I look like. And people are making decisions from that. So I think that, when I think about why we've got to talk about it now, is that unless we can bring this to the surface and really be truthful and compassionate about how we're talking about it, we're actually not going to be able to get to the root cause.
Well, if the other person I'm talking to, or if I don't see the person, I see a stereotype.
Right.
And one thing they say just triggers an automatic response from the left or from the right. We're not going to have a conversation. If we treat people like objects, see them as stereotypes, not much meaningful is going to happen. And if nothing meaningful happens, we're in bad shape. I mean, we really need to talk about where we are,
Right. And honestly talk about where we are. I think that people feel like that we can have this conversation without bringing race into it. And I just don't think that's possible.
Well, that's not just race either. I mean, race is the primary one, but we can talk about gender too, lots of issues, and class for that matter too. So there's a lot of hard things to talk about. What you do a nice job in the first part of the book explaining why that's so difficult. And it's probably, even since you wrote the book in 2022, things have evolved. But why is it that it's so hard to have? I was just telling, sorry for my tangential thing here, but
I like it.
I was just talking, my wife and her best friend, it's her birthday today. So her best friend drove up from Indiana. And we were talking about in Canada. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Canada. And I used to listen to this radio show, and they would bring together 3 politicians, one from the Democratic Party, one from the Democratic Party, or from the Liberal Party, and one from the Conservative. The Conservatives were like Reagan Republicans, and the Democrats were like, or the Liberals were like Democrats, and then New Democrats were kind of like Bernie bros. And they had these three people from those, and they had civil,
Yeah.
wise conversations. There was nothing angry. It was exploring policy, and there was a mutual respect, and it was so much. And I thought, goodness, too bad we just couldn't do that, where we could have a mutually respectful conversation about ideas instead of, oh, you're this, or oh, you're that, you know. So I don't know if the question is this: how do we get there, or just why is it so hard to have these kind of conversations anymore?
I think part of it is because I feel like we have been really conditioned to avoid conflict, first of all.
Mm.
Um, you know, things get tough. We our muscle for being uncomfortable has gotten really weak. So the minute we get uncomfortable, we pull away. We retreat, we shut down. Everyone has their own strategies, but basically, a lot of us avoid. And so when it does happen every time, it's like it's the first time, and so there's that tendency to want to avoid. And I think that we have actually lost our ability to engage and think. We are uncomfortable, and so we now believe that our response to discomfort is to not actually say anything. And I think that one of the things I talk a lot about is this idea of stuffing our emotions. So I don't say anything, but I'm still feeling something, right? I'm still angry or sad or whatever that feeling is. And so that is living in my body. And when I talk about compassionate dialogue, I talk about this idea of it being about self-care, because when we have these things living in our body and we can't find our voice to let it out,
Right.
it's still impacting us, right? And so I think that we need to learn to build that muscle back up, which means that we have to normalize discomfort as a normal part of our interactions, knowing though that the other side of that is something that could be beautiful, like that we can actually grow and learn to love each other, learn to live together, learn the things that we need so that we can coexist.
Yeah, it seems like the risks feel large.
Mm-hmm.
If I talk about race and I say this the wrong way, um, if I'm a person of color talking about race, I might be, my income might be taken away,
Mm-hmm.
or I might be seen in certain ways, or li- uh, uh, set aside as stereotypically an angry. You talk about an angry black woman or whatever it might be, and then I think white people are afraid that they'll say something. Part of it might be they're not conscious of whatever they're thinking, and they're a little afraid of just saying something the wrong way, and then that's going to be a problem. And so people have a lot of fear around race. And the thing is, I think to learn, you have to make mistakes, and making mistakes in this space is a little scary.
Yeah, it's scary, and also because it's scary, that fear really almost has you double down into not ever interrupting, right? So I'm afraid of making the mistake, saying the wrong thing, speaking for a whole group, and it just shuts me down. And so that's why I talk about building this muscle back up to be able to lean into discomfort.
Yeah, I love that. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I had I had a my engagement party. So my husband's white from Montana, and we had an engagement party, and my girlfriend who hosted it made cupcakes, and she made chocolate cupcakes and vanilla cupcakes, and it was super cute, and she had them together. And my student who I was mentoring, who at that time he was a first year student in college, but I had been mentoring him since he was 16. He was really upset about the cupcakes, and I said, what's going on? He's like, that's racist. And I said, honey, what's racist about it? Well, why does she gotta put that out there like that? Like, we know. And I was like, I think it's celebrating us, and so I had to have this whole conversation. And I think that kind of mentality, this like that's that conditioning of, even to say it, to do anything about it, means that when I see it, I'm a racist because I see it. And yet it's completely contradictory to how our human instinct works, is to notice difference. And so the difference isn't really the problem. I believe that the problem is what we believe about that difference, right? It's not a problem that I see you as a white man. It's what I believe about you being a white man, and vice versa, right? And so I just, when I remember when my kiddo did that, I was like, oh, this is deep. Like this is really ingrained in how we have kind of been educated, in the last, decade or so around these topics.
All right. And life is too short not to learn. I think we've got the chance to learn from other people, but if we immediately write them off, we're not going to have a conversation. And yeah, it's not easy, but it. I don't know. Dehumanizing the other person, treating them like an object, is not the solution. No matter. But at the same time, you say that doesn't mean we stand by and let people do things or say things that hurt other people or that are misguided or misinformed. We still have to speak up.
Right. And so really, the protocol itself is about self-regulation, right?
Mm,
It's about like, who do I choose to be in this interaction?
right.
And if I don't regulate my emotions, which when, I describe in my book, as you read, that I'm a Sagittarian and a fire horse. So I can be kind of fiery, that if I don't regulate that, then it's going to impact how I'm engaging. And so my work is to my work is not really if I'm going to say something, it's how I'm going to say it. So I'm
Right.
always constantly trying to figure out how to kind of ride my emotional wave so that is not impacting how I'm engaging with you in the conversation that needs to happen.
I'm really fascinated by this, and I want to come back to that topic because I'm learning all the time about emotion. And, I used to talk about in better conversations, I talk about toxic emotions, and then I'm like, they're not toxic emotions; they're signals. But then at the same time, if I lose my cool, I'm not going to accomplish my goals. So it's that. But I want to come back to that. I want to ask you about something first. Is you talk about a compassionate dialogue, your actual sentence. I want to unpack this because I think it's so rich. You say compassionate dialogue is about grace. So those three words, compassion, dialogue, and grace, tell me what those, we don't have to have a perfect definition here, but what did you mean by those words? It's such a
Um,
rich word phrase.
Yeah, what I meant by compact. Well, so I got to back up a little bit to unpack that for you. When I first was doing my research and I came up with the RIR protocol as part of my research when I was a professor, it was just the protocol on its own. And what I realized is that as I was teaching it, I was inferring compassion, but I didn't explicitly articulate it. And then what I started to see were people kind of weaponizing the protocol. So they're like, well, I
Wow.
recognize that you hurt my feelings. I'm interrupting you by telling you you're a jerk. And I'm going to repair it by never talking to you again. I'm like, oh, wait. So that isn't the intent of the protocol. And so that's when I realized that in order for that protocol, that tool to make sense in the spirit of how it was created, was really that compassion had to overlay that, right?
Mhm.
Compassion says that the way that I'm approaching this is with openness, like with empathy, right? And so, and in doing that, this idea of giving myself grace to know that as I'm engaging in this dialogue, that I'm actually probably going to make some mistakes. And so how do I give myself grace to make those mistakes? But also, how do I give you grace to know that, you may not be showing up as your best self in that moment. You're saying something, but you don't know the impact that it might be having on it. So it really is this idea that I'm entering this with curiosity, with
Mm.
really wanting to understand, and also with the goal not of changing you, but of connecting, right? How do
Mm.
we connect regardless? Even if it's to agree to disagree, we can still have a connection. So for me, compassionate dialogue is really about giving myself and each other grace in this moment of exchanging, ideas and thoughts and beliefs, and doing it with empathy and with love.
That I love this so much, and I've thought a lot about this in the last. This is probably going to go too deep right away, but I've thought a lot about this in the last year, and I thought a lot about suffering in the last year. And like suffering is inevitable. We're going to lose people we love. We're going to face setbacks that seem overwhelming. Um, you know, people have capacity for joy and they have capacity for pain, and sometimes both of those coexist all the time. And I think we are afraid of suffering. We don't really want to, we tend to kind of avoid it. But if I can really understand my own, this, it's already probably getting too deep, but anyway,
Oh, I love it. This is why
like
I want to come.
if I can really understand my own pain, then I can look at that person and say, this too is in me. And
Yes.
if I can say to that person, I'm not living your experience. I don't know what it's like to live in your world, but I too, this too is in me. I have had that feeling. And then we can connect.
Yes.
And then if we can see ourselves, like deeply see ourselves as fellow human beings walking together through the world, and then once we've had that connection, then that opens up a conversation that's not what Marshall Rosenberg would say is a violent conversation. It's a conversation where we share generously our ideas, not in a dehumanizing way, not putting the person down, but here's what I think. What do you think? And we are two people trying to make it out. Like if we were living in a community and the river was rising and the community is going to be gone, we would all get in there. We would all be building the dam and we'd be doing what we could and we'd high five if we stopped the river. But when we get in our day-to-day busyness, sometimes it's hard to see that common humanity. So I think part of compassion is that once you've got compassion, then the opportunity for dialogue is not there. And then is grace forgiveness? Is that what you would mean by, or is that a part of it, do you think?
I think grace for me, it could be forgiveness, but I would also say that grace is understanding. That would probably be a little bit more how I'm using it. It's giving yourself like not being so hard on yourself
Right.
to attain perfection. That when I engage, it's got to be perfect, or I've got to say the right thing. Right.
Right.
It's really about how do I give myself grace to make mistakes. How do I understand that this is a natural part of the process? So I think that's more. I think grace can also be forgiveness for sure. Forgiveness of ourselves, forgiveness of each other. But I think in the larger sense, it's really about understanding.
Right. Right. Well, accepting imperfection, I guess, is the way a good way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could do with more of that for sure. So now you talk about the compassionate dialogue is the mode of discourse, I would say, for the RIR protocol. Could we talk through the first off, is that true? Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I would say that it's the framework, right? It is the what. Like compassionate dialogue is what, and I would say that the RIR is the tool, the how we accomplish that compassionate dialogue.
So it's recognize, interrupt, restore,
Repair.
Repair. Sorry. So what's it mean? What's it mean to recognize as a part of the protocol? And however you want to talk about this would be great. But I kind of wanted to look at all three of these parts.
Yeah, no. So recognize, it's probably the most important, part of it to begin, because recognize is about recognizing what's happening inside our body. I think a lot of times when we're engaging in dialogue, that we are externally focused, right? So you've said or done something, and I'm reacting to what you've said or done. And what's happening in our bodies is kind of instantaneous. We're having a physical reaction. We have feelings about it, but we never slow down enough to think about what those feelings might be and how they might be impacting how I'm choosing to engage with you after that, right? And so this is an invitation to recognize, to slow down and actually acknowledge that you are having an emotional, physical response to whatever that stimuli is in front of you. And then what does that mean? What is my belief about that? Because, all of our lived experiences and our belief systems are impacting how we're moving forward, but it's almost rote, right? We're not stopping to say, oh, this is the response I'm giving to the stimulus. We're just doing it. And so what recognize says is I'm going to slow down and I'm going to acknowledge that, okay, I've got these butterflies in my stomach. I am feeling anxious. And when I feel anxious, this is my normal go-to if I don't ride my emotional wave. And so maybe for me, with being anxious, my normal go-to is to shut down. And so what I know is that if I don't mitigate that feeling, then I may not engage in the conversation. So what it does is it actually empowers me to first take care of what's happening for me so that I can actually engage with you.
So I've got a thought about this. I've thought a lot about this, how we respond emotionally to situations. And let's just use anger as our example, or being triggered. Use the word trigger quite a bit. And it seems to me, this is how I've been working on it. because I don't think you can suppress it. I don't think that's going to be helpful. You have to understand it and deal with it. And I love your wheel for understanding emotions, but what I've come to believe, I'm curious what you think, because I'm not sure this is right, but is that if I figure out where the emotion comes from, and I go, what is the real source of this? Sometimes I identify the source as legitimate, and sometimes I identify the source, really, it's just pride. It's just, and not to say that if you're being mistreated that you should do, but sometimes it's pretty petty. If I really get down to the core. So for me, part of recognize, if I was to use your protocol, would be to ask myself, is this even worth being upset about? Because sometimes it's just like they're not listening to me and I wanted to listen to me, or something where, and not to say that wouldn't be legitimate in some contexts, but for me at least, a lot of the time it's just ego is getting in the way. And if I can get right down to the core of where that comes from, sometimes the anger is legitimate, sometimes it's not worth the effort. And it's actually, if I really think about it, it's kind of almost childish, So that's how I see it. Is it legitimate or is it, let's use childish? I don't know what the terminology is going to be. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Well, and that goes down to like our third step of recognize is what is my belief about this, right? So that's kind of, I think, going along the lines of what you're saying. I think the only thing that might be different as I think about it is that regardless of whether that feeling is legitimate or not, you still have it, right? So if you don't deal with it, it's still, whether or not it could be childish and not legitimate, but if you don't actually deal with it, it is still going to show up. And that's really more the point of the recognize, is to kind of ground yourself and figure out, where am I and how do I self-regulate if I'm in anger, so that it doesn't, whether the anger is righteous or not, so that it doesn't dictate how I interact with you. Because if I'm in anger, the way I'm going to interact with you will 100% be sarcastic and not helpful. You know what I mean? So for me,
Yeah, totally.
to really own that and say, okay, I'm angry. I realize I'm angry. And I know that I need to kind of mitigate that first before I say something to you.
Yeah, because if I lose it, so to speak, then I don't have power in the situation.
Oh, in fact, you've given it away, right?
Exactly. And if I can regulate my emotions, especially when the other person is provoking me, then I can have power. When people who talk about negotiation talk about this. The one last thing about, I'm going to let this go in a second, but that idea of going down to the core is, what I found is when I identify it as childish, sometimes the anger goes away. Because I go, you're really just upset because they're not listening to you, and you're no more important than anybody else. So maybe you should show a little bit. And so sometimes I'm able to deal with the anger that way. But you're right. You have to deal with anger in a way that it doesn't interfere with you achieving your goals.
Right.
And then you've got interrupt. So tell me about the interrupt stage. What happens there? Do you call it stages or phases? I can't remember.
Yeah, it's stages, phases. I would say steps. Yeah.
Okay.
So interrupt is, so once I've kind of recognized and I'm clear and I'm self-regulated, right? So I'm moving from dysregulation to self-regulation.
Right.
I want to interrupt. And I think people, they think of interrupt and they think of it as this harsh thing. And it really isn't. But the reason I chose like specifically interrupt is because the idea of interrupt is to stop something, right? It's to actually stop something. So you wouldn't think twice if two kids were fighting on the yard to interrupt it. Like, you would stop it. You're not trying to figure out who's right or wrong in the moment. You're just trying to stop the harm from happening. Right. And so that's if you think of interrupt as stopping harm, if we're talking about interpersonal, even organizationally, right? We're stopping the harm of a policy or practice, but at this interpersonal, I'm stopping it. So, but what I want to do, and this is the compassion piece, is I want to stop it, and I want to do it in a way that, one, I'm stopping the behavior, but I want to seek to understand also where it's coming from. I want to make sure that what I heard and what I interpreted is actually true. I want to actually understand your intent, right? So depending on what is said, it gives me an opportunity to then move to inquiry, right? Where I really, it's not about making you wrong or making you apologize. It's really about me understanding, where are you coming from with this? What is your intent behind this? And then once I understand that, then I can decide what my next steps are, right? But I think a lot of times, because like if you trigger anger in me, might interrupt, I may stop it, but I may not, if I just stop it without seeking to understand the kind of the impetus for it, then it's too easy for me to write you off. And we see that happen all the time, where unless you're in relationship with someone, meaning, they're your family or your closest friends, where you would, once you kind of cool down, you'll, re-engage. When it's colleagues and people that you work with, people who are a little further away from your inner circle, it becomes easier to let them go. And I think that we've done that, especially with cancel culture now, it's just kind of the norm. You say something I don't want, and all of a sudden, instead of understanding that you may be a good person who said something, bad, for lack of a better term, I'm going to write you off. And so we have this good, bad binary that doesn't actually allow us to see any gray. I can be a really good person who made a really bad mistake. And
Right.
we don't make room for that anymore. We don't make room for error at all.
Now we live in a time where unfriending is more popular than friending.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we don't, and if we look back, we're not even sure why. And so we create, because we actually don't know why. We're not even sure that we heard the right thing. We create a narrative in our head that reinforces. It's like that cognitive affirmation bias, right? I'm going to reinforce that belief of what I think you did. And so now I keep building this narrative in my head about how bad of a person you are.
Exactly. And that reinforces the idea that I'm a good person. So it gets complicated.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so last part is repaired. Let's talk about repair.
Yeah. So once we interrupt, and the repair is a little less defined simply because it's 100% dependent on how the interrupt goes, right? So just say you say something to me and it triggers anger. I ride my wave. I ask, I can literally say and interrupt and say, "Wow, that really hurt me." And was that your intention? I tend to be direct like that. I think it's harder for some people to get to that place, but
Right.
I like to cut to the chase. So if your answer to that question is yes, then I might have one more question for you. Is like, why would you want to hurt me? Right.
Mm.
And then depending on your answer depends on my repair. So repair is about re-engaging. It's about how do we reconnect after that to show that we're okay, to demonstrate that, like we survived this, and, normalizing conflict as a part of just human dynamics. But also I say that repair is sometimes divorce. Sometimes, if your answer to that question of you wanting to hurt me is yes, and your answer to why is like, I don't like you and I never have, well, then my repair is like, well, thanks for letting me know. But at least now when I cut you off, I'm completely clear that I have done it for the right reasons, right? As opposed to cutting you off thinking I've done it for the right reasons. So interrupt is about gaining clarity and understanding motives, understanding people, understanding, kind of the nuances behind whatever that interaction is. And then repair is about, if we can, how do we deepen this relationship, reconnect, and move forward together.
I love it. And if we've genuinely had a compassionate conversation in the interrupt, well, in all three parts, but if the inquiry during interrupt has been genuinely compassionate, there's a much greater chance of repair.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have yet, when I am willing to be vulnerable and show up that way, I have yet to have someone not meet me there.
Well, that's great. So can you talk us through an example of a situation where somebody would use the RIR protocol?
Yeah. I mean, one of the examples I actually gave in the book, which is super, I mean, it was, for me, it just reinforced the power of the tool, was my girlfriend who we had been friends for years, and she was always like, the grass is always greener. We would make plans. She would cancel on me. And she did it on one night on New Year's Eve. Right. And it broke my heart. Like literally it was, and I kept thinking, why am I friends with someone like this? Like I don't have people in my life who are so careless with my emotions. And she came the next day, I sat her down, and with tears in my eyes, I was like, I love you and I want nothing but the best for you, but we cannot be friends anymore. And she was really taken aback. She's like, why? I was like, because I don't have people who treat me this way. I said, what you did last night was kind of like the last straw. And I don't need to recount, the times that, you've done this. I said, but I love you, and this isn't going to work anymore for me. I said, so, so we talked about it. I think what's a little bit unique here is that I had already, because I had tried to interrupt many times and talk to her, and she didn't respond. It just kept happening. So this was kind of almost like a repair going through the entire process, though, sharing her, because I had already made up my mind at this point. But I knew that I had this tool, and I knew that I just couldn't cut her off without talking to her about it first. I wanted her to be clear why we were no longer in each other's lives. So I would say that for easily 6 months, I realized that she, we played volleyball together, we played softball together, we were in book club together. I would see her 2 to 3 times a week. And so it made it really hard, but I was polite, everything. And then she really worked. She saw it and she worked hard to win it back. And I think that's also the repair, is that just because in that moment I had decided that we couldn't be friends anymore, I was still open. I believed her to be a good person. I just didn't believe that she knew how to take care of my heart, right? And so as she worked over it and I allowed her kind of back in, we now have a much more healthy, beautiful relationship today than we ever would have had if I didn't hold her accountable. So repair is also about setting boundaries, right?
Mhm.
So we can choose, people do things to us, and it's easy to blame the people for it, but there's a point where we allow people to do things to us, right?
Mhm.
We're allow repeated behavior, negative behavior to happen, and then we're still mad about it. So I feel like that's where the protocol really comes into place, is saying, I need to set a boundary for how we're going to engage so that I can take care of myself.
That's well, what I love about your story, and I remember it from the book, but what I love about the story is there's hope. Like we're not stuck with this relationship. It could get better. It could get worse too, I suppose. But when you're in the moment, it feels like it's always going to be like this. But
Yeah,
if we use your protocol, we can break things up and get to the core and either heal or at least be in a safer place either way, So
absolutely. Absolutely. I did a talk, and and so the power of the protocol, I'm someone who's lived it, created it, but I
right.
did this talk, and in 2 hours, I'm always hopeful that when I do a 2 hour that you walk away with something, but I'm not sure what exactly that looks like. But I had the opportunity after I did one, the person emailed me 2 days later and said, I walked away from that, and I had a friend that I had just stopped talking to because he was using drugs. I felt like he was going down the wrong path, and I just cut him off. And I actually went back and talked to him after that. I shared with him how I was feeling, how I was afraid to lose him. And she's like, and I set boundaries for how we could stay in contact with each other. And she said it was amazing. And for me, I get chills thinking about it, because that was a 2 hour, it resonated with someone. And instead of avoiding a conversation that needed to happen with someone she loved, she had that conversation. And again, you meet somebody, they usually meet you where you are. She showed up loving, vulnerable, sharing how she felt, and talking about what she needed to happen for that relationship to remain intact. And he gave it to her, right? People, when you love each other, you want to support each. I mean, you just don't
Mhm.
know how all the time, right? And so, and I think we do a disservice when we're not willing to be honest about, and I think you talked about ego. I think that's where ego comes in, right? My ego prevents me from being vulnerable because I don't want to be perceived as weak, or I don't want to get hurt, or whatever my ego thinks it's protecting, me from.
Yep. I don't want to be one down.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't want to put myself in a submissive position.
Right.
I
Right.
don't I don't want to even confront the fact that what I did deserves an apology.
Right.
And so it must be the other person's fault. So yeah. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has this quote that I quote all the time, and he says it's in his book "No Future Without Forgiveness," which is about the meetings they had after apartheid was dismantled, and they went around the country and they had people ask for forgiveness and talk about the atrocities they did in South Africa. And the quote is something to the effect of, "There's a radical brokenness in all of existence. Times are out of joint, alienation, disharmony characterize so much of life. And I think what you do is you're healing that radical brokenness because we are not meant to be, or we are not wired to be out of connection with other people to not see. We are wired to connect, but we're
Okay.
broken. And so to me, what you do is you give us a really good strategy for helping us heal that brokenness. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, thank you. I really do hope that's what it's doing. That is the goal. Um, and to really see each other beneath the facade, right?
Right.
Of everything that we're projecting out, where politics and, all those things are not, don't, we're getting to the core of the person. Who are you in your core?
Yeah. Um, I've got a question you may not have an answer to, but our TLC conference is coming up in October 6th and 7th, I think. 5th is the pre-conference, 6th and 7th. Do you have any thought about what you might be presenting at the conference? Anything you're thinking about? You're probably like, now that I've been asked the question, maybe this. So I'm
No, no,
wondering.
no. So what's interesting is, we were talking about this, but this is the book. So
Right.
the Compassionate Dialogue Journey came out this year, this year. And the reason it came out was that it's a workbook, which I didn't initially start it off as a workbook, but I
Right.
realized that I wanted people who this resonated with to really be able to dig deeper into it. And so I've been playing this year. I just created a 2-day training for CSLA, California State Leadership Academy, to really do that intrapersonal work, to really take that time and slow down and look at ourselves and what has our lived experiences kind of contributed to how we're showing up and how we're doing our work and how we're engaging with each other. And so, that's what I'm toying with now. I mean, it's still a year away for me. But this idea of how do we heal ourselves so that we can be healthy, to engage with other people. I think, I think when we're broken, it's hard not to bring that brokenness to our relationships. And so, how do we
Yeah.
slow down and heal ourselves so that I can show up whole, in relationship
Yeah. Or at least more whole,
more?
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so thank you so much. I want to go back to the beginning of your book. So the beginning of the book, your dedication says in part, it's either love or fear. Let's choose love. So what do you mean by saying let's choose love?
I believe in the interconnectedness of all of us.
Right.
Um, and I would love, in the work that I do, there's a lot of pushback about, even the concept and construct of race. And how I talk about it is I would love to be in a place where I could talk about us as humans because we're all having a human experience, right? But right now I have to talk about this construct of race because that supersedes our humanity, unfortunately, in a lot of spaces. And so, for me, if we can focus on love and our connectedness, then we can see beyond
Mm.
our skin color and our perceived differences. That somehow, because our skin colors don't match, that we are not family, that we are not connected.
Mm. I love that. I love it so much. Do you know that song by Solomon Burke, None of Us Are Free? It's,
Oh, go
it's
ahead.
such a beautiful song. He says, essentially, the core idea is none of us are free. If one of us is chained, none of us are free. And Solomon Burke's amazing, but that's the idea. I think that idea that we are human, and in our humanity, there's connection. I think it comes up over and over again in all kinds of whether it's Bob Marley or the Apostles' Creed, it pops up everywhere. So
Yeah.
cool. Nancy, I'm so grateful for your book, for your ideas, but I'm also especially grateful for this conversation and the more we're going to have. I'm so grateful for them. So
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much. I really I was looking forward to this today, and just looking in for as I read, even your chapter on the partnership principles, and just really love seeing, that all of us are doing this work, and it's coming at it maybe from a little different angles, but I think that's important for as many different people out there. You know, my work is not going to speak to everyone and vice versa. So, you know, collectively we are working toward the greater good. And so I'm in gratitude for what you do too.
Oh, well, the way forward is love. There's no doubt about it. I believe that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.